While crawling on my hands and knees under my truck, I was shocked to see my son live streaming me from the window, captioned "Unpaid Old Servant of My House." At least, he's still useful at this age. His wife even dropped 3 laughing emojis in the chat. I stared blankly at the screen for 3 full minutes, then silently walked away. The next morning, sitting alone in a motel room, my phone buzzed incessantly with panicked text messages from them, asking, "What happened to the card? Thank you for being here. Before we begin, drop a comment below. Is this your first time listening? Or have we met in a previous story? Your presence truly matters." Just a note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the message I hope you'll carry with you. The phone screen glowed with 4,200 likes on a notification that my son had just hosted a live stream of me crawling under my own car captioned "Unpaid Old Servant of My House." And my son's name was right there in the post. But that came later. 5 hours earlier, I was sitting in my backyard with Ralph Graves over morning tea. Ralph was 65, a retired postal worker with knowing eyes and the bluntness of a man who delivered bad news for 40 years. He set down his teacup on the patio table and asked the question I'd been avoiding for months. "Do you know how much your son owes?" I looked at him over the rim of my own cup. November morning light filtered through the backyard oak tree, dappling the concrete with shadows that shifted like uncertainty. I was 60 years old, silver, threading through my hair hands, calloused from a lifetime of fixing things myself. 1 year ago, I'd buried my wife Elaine in this same autumn light. 1 year ago, I'd stopped knowing how to say no to my only child. "I saw him take that drill yesterday," Ralph continued. "The Black & Decker. Wasn't that your father-in-law's?" "It belonged to Elaine's father," I said quietly. "It's not Wilder's." "I know grief makes us generous," Ralph said, "but a year is long enough to stop being blind." I didn't answer. Instead, I watched a sparrow land on the fence and thought about the past 12 months. Wilder had moved in with his wife Paloma right after the funeral, temporarily, he'd said. Just until they got back on their feet. The electricity bills had doubled. The garage had become his storage unit. My truck got parked in the driveway while his BMW sat protected inside. Not once in 365 days had he asked, "Dad, do you need anything?" The drill wasn't the first thing. There had been the socket wrench set in August, the hedge trimmer in September. Small things, I'd told myself. Things a son might borrow. "He's not borrowing them," Ralph said, reading my silence. "I've seen him load tools into his trunk 3 times this month. He's selling them." The tea had gone cold in my hands. I set the cup down carefully, watching my reflection warp in the curved ceramic. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Ralph stood to leave, pausing at the gate. "You've done everything yourself for 60 years, Arthur. Built this house up from nothing with Elaine. Don't let him take that from you, too." After he left, I sat alone in the morning, quiet, and thought about my wife. Elaine and I used to play Chinese chess on this patio every Sunday. Her red rook still sat on the board inside, exactly where she'd left it the week before she died. I hadn't moved it, couldn't move it. I loved my son. That was my greatest sin. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was in the garage reorganizing the tools Wilder had left scattered across my workbench. The concrete floor was cold even through my jeans. I'd crawled under my F-15 to retrieve a wrench that had rolled beneath the oil pan when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out expecting a hydration reminder. Instead, I saw a notification Wilder Stafford was live. My son was 32 years old. I'd taught him to change oil when he was 16, taught him to respect other people's property when he was 8. Somewhere between then and now, those lessons had evaporated. I opened TikTok. The live stream was being broadcast from the upstairs window, the bedroom I'd given him, and Paloma, the one with the view of the garage. It showed me from above, crawling on my hands and knees under the truck, my gray hair catching the overhead light. The live caption read, "Unpaid Old Servant of My House. At least he's still useful at this age." 4,200 likes, 637 comments. And there, floating in the live chat, Paloma had left 3 laughing emojis. I watched the screen for a moment, seeing myself disappear under the truck emerge with the wrench wipe my hands on a rag. A stranger watching this broadcast would see an old man doing yard work. An old man serving someone else. My house, my truck, my garage, my tools. And he had the audacity to call it his. I scrolled through the live comments in disbelief. Strangers from across the country had watched me crawl under my own vehicle in my own garage and laughed. Some said I looked sad, some said I looked broken. One person wrote, "Why doesn't he just leave?" Good question. The Westminster house I'd bought with Elaine 30 years ago was worth $1.1 million now. We'd repainted every wall together. She'd chosen the kitchen tiles on her hands and knees, measuring each placement. I'd installed the deck railing board by board while she supervised with iced tea and commentary. Wilder had lived here for exactly 12 months and called it his. You know, the moment when you finally see yourself through someone else's eyes? This was mine. I wasn't angry. Anger is hot, impulsive, loud. What I felt was ice-cold clarity. 4,200 people had watched me be invisible in my own life, but only one person needed to see what happened next. I thought about Elaine, about the way she used to look at me over the chessboard patient and steady waiting for me to see the move I'd been missing, about the last thing she'd said to me in the hospital, "Take care of yourself. Promise me." I'd broken that promise for a year. Grief had made me soft, generous, blind like Ralph said. But grief has a shelf life, and I just hit the expiration date. I set the phone down next to the wrench on the concrete floor. The cold from the garage seeped through my jeans, grounding me. I didn't move for 3 full minutes, just sat there under the truck, looking at that screen, watching the light count tick up to 4,206. Every single tick of that digital counter felt like a heavy hammer striking my chest, shattering the last remaining fragments of my paternal leniency. I could hear the muffled sounds of the television coming from the upper floor of my house, where my 32-year-old son and his wife were likely relaxing on the furniture my savings had purchased. They were laughing at the digital validation of my public humiliation, completely unaware that the silent old man beneath the grease-stained Ford F-15 had just crossed a psychological point of no return. I hauled myself out from under the chassis, the joints in my knees popping in the quiet garage space. The oil rag in my hand felt heavy, soaked with the grime of labor that had been taken for granted for 365 consecutive days. I looked around the room that had once been my sanctuary, a workshop of clean, organized boards where every screwdriver and wrench had a designated home. Now it was cluttered with plastic storage bins, imported car detailing kits for a vehicle I didn't own, and empty Amazon boxes that Paloma had discarded without a second thought. I walked over to the wooden workbench I had built out of reclaimed oak with my own hands 3 decades ago. My fingers traced the deep gouges in the wood where Wilder had carelessly dropped heavy metal parts without using a protective mat. It was a small detail, but microscopic disrespect accumulates over a year until it forms an unbending wall of absolute alienation. I looked at the ancient Black & Decker drill press standing in the corner, the one Ralph had mentioned earlier. It had been a wedding present from Elaine's father, a heavy cast-iron machine that had drilled thousands of precise holes for our home improvement projects. Wilder had already taken the portable hand drill, but he hadn't managed to lug this heavy monster out to his trunk yet. He was treating my history, my memories, and my physical endurance as an open liquidation sale to fund a lifestyle he could not afford on his own. I pulled a clean sheet of paper from a dusty notepad hanging near the electrical panel. My hand was steady. The tremors of sorrow that had plagued my fingers since Elaine's funeral completely gone, replaced by the rigid stability of a structural engineer assessing a collapsed foundation. The list would not be an emotional outburst. It would be a cold execution of financial and domestic boundaries that should have been drawn the moment his luxury German sedan occupied my enclosed garage stall. The first item on that paper didn't require any legal counsel or complex strategy. It was a simple rectangular piece of plastic that resided in his leather wallet bearing my name and my credit line. I had given it to him under the guise of helping him purchase groceries and fuel while he transitioned between real estate agencies, but the monthly statements told a drastically different story of premium steak dinners, digital streaming subscriptions, and high-end clothing boutique charges. I walked out of the garage and entered the house through the mudroom, my boots clicking softly on the linoleum tiles. The kitchen was pristine, exactly as Elaine had left it, except for a stack of unwashed designer coffee mugs in the sink that didn't belong to me. I ignored them, walking straight to the small writing desk in the hallway, where the landline telephone sat. I didn't use the mobile device this time. I wanted the stability of the hardwired line as I dialed the toll-free customer service number printed on the back of my primary financial statements. The automated voice response system was mechanical and uncaring, a perfect reflection of the state of mind I had adopted. "Welcome to Premier Account Services," the robotic woman said through the receiver. I pressed the corresponding numbers, with deliberate force entering my account identification and navigating through the multi-tiered security verification menus. To report a card lost stolen, or to manage secondary users, press 3, the prompt instructed. I pressed 3. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. "Please enter the 4-digit extension of the authorized user you wish to deactivate." The voice continued. I didn't have to look up the numbers. I had memorized his specific card extension after reviewing the 4-figure balances that had arrived in my mailbox every month. 3921. User Wilder Stafford has been removed from this account. This card will be declined effective immediately. Would you like to notify the user via automated text message? Seals. No. I muttered into the receiver, pressing the button to finalize the cancellation. Let the notification arrive in the form of an embarrassing rejection at a retail counter or a gas pump. Let the reality of his financial independence hit him when there was a line of strangers standing behind him, watching his assumed privilege dissolve in a sequence of red text on a payment terminal. I hung up the phone and stood in the absolute silence of the downstairs corridor. From this vantage point, I could see into the living room where the Chinese chessboard remained under the soft afternoon light. The red rook sat precisely where Elaine's hand had deposited it before the ambulance ride that took her away from this house forever. For 12 months, I had allowed that board to collect dust, because moving any piece felt like erasing her final physical decision on this earth. But looking at it now, I realized that allowing her memory to be insulted by the laughter of our entitled child was the real erasure. I walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry. Wilder and Paloma had rearranged the shelves, moving my simple staples. The rolled oats, the canned beans, the ground black coffee to the highest, least accessible ledges, replacing them with expensive organic supplements, imported sparkling waters, and artisanal snacks that cost more than a full day of my pension. They had colonized my domestic space slice by slice, assuming that my silence was a sign of intellectual decay or emotional defeat. I pulled my old metal step stool out from the corner, climbed up, and systematically began moving my items back to the center shelves. I didn't throw their expensive groceries on the floor. I simply stacked them neatly in a corner of the counter, creating a physical boundary that required them to acknowledge my presence every time they entered the room. It was a silent opening salvo, a declaration that the invisible servant had left the building, replaced by the man who legally owned every square inch of the timber and drywall, holding this roof over their heads. My phone buzzed again in my denim pocket. I didn't want to look at it, fearing another notification from the live stream that was currently broadcasting my private life to thousands of anonymous voyeurs, but it was a direct text message from Ralph. "I'm down at the hardware store on Westminster Avenue. They've got a sale on heavy-duty commercial padlocks, the ones with the reinforced steel shanks. Want me to pick a few up for your tool chests?" I typed a brief response. "Get 4, and pick up a heavy latch set for the garage rolling door while you're there. I'll pay you back before dinner." Ralph didn't reply, with words just a thumbs-up icon. He had lived next door for 3 decades. He had watched Wilder grow from a hyperactive child into an arrogant young adult, and he knew exactly what kind of storm was brewing in my backyard. He had been the one to pull me aside during the repainting of the back deck 5 years ago to tell me that Wilder was borrowing money from local business owners under my name, a debt I had quietly settled back then to preserve the family reputation. I had thought I was protecting my son's future, but in reality, I had just been reinforcing his belief that his father was an infinite financial safety net with no breaking point. I walked up the carpeted stairs toward the master bedroom, avoiding the 3rd step from the top that always creaked when weight was applied. I didn't want them to hear me moving through the house. I needed the element of surprise to remain intact until the new boundaries were physically installed and unyielding. I stepped into my bedroom, the space cold and smelling faintly of the lavender sachets Elaine used to place in the cedar wardrobe. Her clothes were still hanging there, protected by plastic garment bags. Dresses she had worn to weddings, casual blouses she had used during her gardening sessions, and the heavy winter coat we had purchased during our anniversary trip to Oregon. I hadn't been able to touch them for 365 days. Every time I opened that wardrobe door, the scent of her presence would overwhelm me, leaving me paralyzed on the edge of the mattress for hours. But today the scent didn't bring tears. It brought an intense protective rage. I reached into the very back of the wardrobe behind the formal suits I rarely wore anymore and pulled out the small fireproof combination, safe where the house deed, the vehicle titles, and Elaine's personal documents were stored. I spun the mechanical dial with practiced precision, left to 42, right to 15, left to 88. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. Inside lay the original certificate of title for the Westminster property stamped by the county recorder in 1996. $1.1 million of real estate equity completely paid off through 30 years of on-time monthly payments, overtime shifts at the manufacturing plant, and meticulous budgeting. My son had lived here for 12 months without contributing a single dollar toward the property taxes, the structural insurance, or the maintenance of the landscape. He had treated this monument of marital labor as a free resort, a temporary parking space for his depreciating European sports car, while he calculated his next financial maneuver. Beside the deed lay a small leather-bound notebook with a brass clasp. It was Elaine's private journal from her final months, an item I had found tucked inside her sewing basket after the hospital staff handed me her belongings. I hadn't opened it yet. The fear of reading her final thoughts of encountering her pain when I wasn't there to soothe it had kept that brass clasp firmly shut for a year. I picked it up now, feeling the cool texture of the leather against my calloused palm. I didn't open it yet, not here, not while my son was still breathing my air under my roof, but I slipped it into my jacket pocket along with the house title and the vehicle documents. I locked the safe, pushed it back into the depths of the closet, and walked over to the dresser. I gathered 3 pairs of heavy work jeans, 5 flannel shirts, a week's worth of undergarments, and my heavy leather boots. I packed them into the canvas duffel bag I had used during my service years, compressing the fabric down until the zipper closed with difficulty. I wasn't abandoning my property. I was creating a tactical distance. I was removing myself from the immediate domestic equation so I could execute the next phases of my list without the distraction of daily arguments or emotional manipulation. As I carried the heavy duffel bag down the stairs, I heard the door to the upstairs suite click open. Wilder stood on the landing wearing a silk bathrobe that had belonged to a luxury hotel chain, another item he had likely acquired on someone else's credit line. He had an expensive espresso cup in his hand, his hair perfectly coiffed, looking down at me with an expression of mild amusement that turned into confusion when he saw the canvas bag in my left hand. "Heading out somewhere, Dad?" he asked, his voice dripping with the casual condescension that had become his default tone over the past year. "Don't forget the lawn needs to be edged before the homeowner association inspection on Thursday. I noticed some weeds coming up near the curb line." I stopped at the bottom of the steps, my hand resting on the carved oak banister. I looked up at him, studying the smooth, unlined face of a 32-year-old man who had never known the bone-deep exhaustion of a 40-hour work week, or the terrifying responsibility of protecting a family through a financial recession. He looked exactly like his mother around the eyes, but the spirit behind those eyes was entirely hollow, devoid of the integrity and resilience that had defined Elaine's existence. "The lawn tools are in the garage. Is he Wilder?" I said, my voice completely flat, stripped of any parental warmth or familiar inflection. "You know where the mower is. You've watched me use it enough times." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the entryway. "Yeah, well, my back has been acting up since that tennis match on Saturday. I figured since you were already down there tinkering with the truck, you could just handle the perimeter loop. Paloma wants to have some friends over for a patio dinner next weekend, and the yard looks a little neglected." "I won't be handling the perimeter loop," I said quietly. He blinked his amusement, fading into a slight scowl as he took a sip from his espresso cup. "Whatever. Just make sure the garage door stays closed. The dust from your sanding gets all over the BMW's finish, and it cost me $80 to get it detailed at the car wash down on Brookhurst." I didn't answer him. I didn't point out that the BMW was currently sitting in a garage that my labor had built, while my own truck was parked under the autumn rain, collecting leaves and bird droppings. I didn't mention the TikTok livestream that was currently collecting likes at the expense of my human dignity. I simply turned my back on him, walked through the front door, and stepped out into the crisp November air. The driveway was slick with fallen leaves from the old oak tree. I walked over to my Ford F-150, tossed the canvas duffel bag into the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. The engine roared to life with a familiar mechanical rumble, a solid American V8 that had never failed me through 200,000 miles of travel. I looked back at the house through the rearview mirror. Wilder was still standing at the upstairs window, looking down at me with his phone already back in his hand, likely checking the metrics on his latest social media upload. I shifted the truck into reverse and backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel at the edge of the asphalt. As I turned onto the main avenue heading toward the commercial district of Garden Grove, I reached down and touched the edge of the notebook in my jacket pocket. The list in my mind was expanding, growing from 7 simple items into a comprehensive blueprint for domestic reclamation. My son had called this his house in front of 4,200 strangers. He had assumed that an old man's grief was a permanent disability, a weakness that could be exploited until there was nothing left but an empty shell and a signed inheritance form. But he had miscalculated the nature of my silence. I hadn't been surrendering, I had been mourning. And now the mourning period was officially over. I pulled into the parking lot of the small motel near the freeway entrance, the neon sign buzzing faintly against the gray sky. I paid the desk clerk in cash, walked down the outdoor walkway to room 114, and dropped my duffel bag onto the synthetic comforter of the double bed. The room was small, clinical, and completely devoid of personal history. It was exactly what I needed: a sterile staging ground, where I could sit with my thoughts, review the financial liabilities my son had accumulated under my roof, and prepare the first formal notices that would change his comfortable reality forever. I sat down at the small laminate desk in the corner of the room, pulled out the notepad from my pocket, and wrote down the first item with a heavy black pen, drawing a thick, uncompromising line directly through it: credit card deactivated. The first brick in his wall of entitlement had just been removed. There were 6 more to go, and I had all the time in the world to pull them down one by one until his entire fraudulent structure collapsed at his feet. I walked through my front door at noon, like I'd only been gone for groceries, not a night of strategic planning. Wilder and Paloma were waiting in the living room. Both had phones in their hands. Both looked like they'd been pacing. Wilder stood when I entered, his face flushed with the particular shade of red that comes from anger mixed with confusion. "Is your dad, where the hell have you been?" he said. "I've been calling you all morning. What happened with the card OX?" I walked past him without answering, past Paloma, who sat on the couch with her arms crossed, her 29-year-old face pinched into an expression I'd seen too many times this year, the look of someone who'd been inconvenienced by reality. I went to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Wilder's footsteps following. "Dad, seriously, are you going to answer me?" I pulled a pot from the cabinet, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. From the refrigerator, I took out rice noodles, green onions, and a single egg. Ingredients for 1. "What are you doing?" Paloma had joined him in the doorway now. "We've been trying to reach you since 7 this morning." I turned on the burner and waited for the water to boil. "This is ridiculous," Wilder said. "The card stopped working at the gas station yesterday. I had to call Paloma to come get me. Do you know how embarrassing that was?" The water began to simmer. I added the noodles. "Are you seriously just going to ignore us?" Paloma's voice had gone up an octave. I stirred the noodles slowly, watching them soften in the heat. Added the egg. Watched the white bloom and solidify around the yolk. Sprinkled the green onions on top. The kitchen filled with the smell of simple food, the kind Elaine used to make when one of us needed comfort. When the noodles were ready, I drained them, transferred them to a single bowl, and sat down at the kitchen table. Wilder and Paloma stood in the doorway watching me with identical expressions of disbelief. I picked up my chopsticks and ate. They had been calling for hours, panicking, demanding, expecting me to fix their problem. Explain my absence, restore their convenience. But their panic was irrelevant to my plan. It always had been. 3 sentences. That was all it took to rewrite 12 months of silence. I finished the bowl slowly, set down the chopsticks, took a sip of water. Then I looked up at my son and his wife for the first time since I'd walked through the door. From now on, I said, everyone pays their own way. Your car, your problem. Your food, your bill. Your mess, your cleanup. Wilder's mouth opened. "What?" I stood up, picked up my bowl, washed it in the sink, dried it, and put it back in the cabinet. Then I walked past them toward my bedroom. "Are you seriously?" Paloma started. I closed my bedroom door behind me and heard nothing else. Through the wall, I could hear their muffled voices rising in pitch, hear Wilder's frustration turning into what sounded like genuine confusion. "Good. Confusion was the first step toward understanding. Understanding was the first step toward change. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at Elaine's photograph on the nightstand. She would have handled this differently. She would have sat them down, explained calmly, given them a chance to apologize and adjust. But Elaine was gone, and I was done explaining. 2 days later, on Wednesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen washing my lunch dishes when I heard Wilder's voice from the front yard. "Dad, can you check my tire? I think it's flat." I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked to the front window. His black BMW sat in the driveway with the front left tire visibly deflated. Wilder stood beside it, phone in hand, looking toward the house expectantly. I went outside. "Thank God," he said when he saw me. "I was about to call a tow truck. Can you take a look?" I walked over to the car, looked at the flat tire, looked at my 32-year-old son. Then I turned around and walked back toward the house. "Dad, where are you going?" I went to the garage, retrieved the 1987 car repair manual I'd used to teach myself maintenance when Elaine and I couldn't afford mechanics, and picked up my complete wrench set from the locked toolbox I'd brought back from the motel. Walked back outside and placed both on the BMW's hood. "I've done all this myself for the past 60 years, I said. "You're 28 years younger than me." Then I walked back inside. Behind me, I heard a long, frustrated sigh, that particular exhale of someone realizing the world wouldn't bend for him anymore. I stopped at the kitchen window and looked out. Wilder stood beside his car, staring at the manual and the wrenches like they were artifacts from another civilization. He picked up the manual, flipped through a few pages, set it down. Picked up a wrench, turned it over in his hands, set it down. Looked at the flat tire, looked at the house, looked back at the tire. He crouched down beside the wheel. Grief had kept me frozen, but anger was teaching me to move again. For the first time in a year, since the morning I'd stood beside Elaine's grave while Wilder checked his phone during the eulogy, I felt the corners of my mouth pull upward. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't triumphant or cruel. It was just the small, involuntary expression of someone who'd forgotten what satisfaction felt like and was surprised to rediscover it. I watched my son struggle with the wrench for 3 minutes. Watched him flip through the manual with oil-stained fingers. Watched him figure out slowly and frustratingly how to position the jack. He didn't call out for help again. Maybe he knew I wouldn't come. Maybe he was finally learning what I'd tried to teach him 20 years ago, that competence isn't inherited, it's earned. I stood at that window until he got the spare tire on. It took him 40 minutes. When he finished, he was sweating despite the November cold, and there was a streak of grease across his expensive shirt. He loaded the tools back onto the hood and walked toward the house. I moved away from the window before he could see me watching. That night I lay in bed and thought about the list I'd written in the motel. 7 items, 2 complete, the credit card, the free labor, 5 remaining. But the tools and the tire were just the beginning. I picked up my son's golf clubs from my sofa Thursday afternoon and carried them upstairs like I was removing evidence from a crime scene. The tire had been the lesson. This was the reclamation. Wilder's things had spread through my living room like an infection over the past 12 months. Golf clubs leaning against the armchair where Elaine used to read. Nike shoes kicked off by the coffee table. His designer jacket draped over the back of the sofa. Magazines scattered across the floor. Fitness cars, luxury watches. Not a single book. I gathered everything methodically, placed it all in a large wicker basket I'd bought that morning, specifically for this purpose. Carried the basket upstairs and set it outside his bedroom door without knocking. Then I went back downstairs and cleaned. I mopped the entire living room floor with pine cleaner, the sharp scent cutting through months of accumulated neglect. The smell reminded me of Elaine. She'd always used pine cleaner on Thursdays, said it made the house feel renewed before the weekend. When the floor dried, I walked to the garage and retrieved the ebony chessboard from the shelf where I had stored it after the funeral, carried it back inside, and placed it on the low table by the window, the exact position where Elaine and I had sat every evening for 30 years. The pieces were still arranged mid-game. Her red rook stood in the center of the board, exactly where she'd moved it the night before she went to the hospital. I'd never moved it, couldn't move it. That rook was the last decision she'd made in this house, the last time her fingers had touched something that would remain after she was gone. I stood looking at it for a long time, remembering how she'd smiled when she made that move, how she'd said, "Your turn," and I'd told her we could finish the game tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Territory isn't about furniture, it's about the ghosts that get to stay. From the closet, I retrieved a framed photograph I'd wrapped in newspaper the day after the funeral. Wilder at age 10, sitting on my shoulders at Westminster Park, both of us grinning at Elaine behind the camera. That was the last birthday he'd asked me to carry him, the last time he'd looked at me like I was his hero. I hung the photo on the wall above the chessboard. The living room was mine again. The space breathed differently now, cleaner, quieter, emptier. But it felt emptier in a way that hurt less like an old wound that finally had room to heal. I sat in Elaine's chair and looked at the room we'd built together, at the chessboard where we'd spent thousands of evenings, at the photo of the son we'd raised before something went wrong. Then I picked up my phone and called the locksmith. Kevin Howell arrived Friday morning at 8 sharp. He was in his 40s with efficient hands and the discretion of someone who'd installed locks on 1,000 angry divorces. He didn't ask questions, just nodded when I showed him the 2 doors, master bedroom and study. The biometric, and I said, fingerprint recognition, just mine. Standard installation takes about 40 minutes per door, he said, opening his equipment case. I sat on the living room sofa with the newspaper while he worked. The drill whined. The smell of wood dust drifted down the hallway. Progress measured in noise and debris. Wilder came home halfway through the second installation. I heard his car in the driveway, heard the front door open, heard his footsteps stop abruptly when he saw the locksmith kneeling by the study door with a drill in his hand. "What are you doing, Dad?" His voice came from the hallway. "Why are you putting locks on the doors?" As I turned the page of the newspaper without looking up. "Dad." Changing the lock, I said, "My house." 2 words. That was all the explanation he deserved. "Your house, it's..." He stopped. I could hear him processing, trying to find an argument that wouldn't expose exactly how entitled he'd become. I looked up from the newspaper then, met his eyes. He saw something in my face he'd never seen before. Not anger, not even coldness. Just absolute resolution. The look of a man who'd finished negotiating. He fell silent. Kevin finished the study door 15 minutes later. Showed me how to program my fingerprint, tested the mechanism 3 times. The lock responded with a soft electronic beep and a definitive mechanical click. "You're all set," Kevin said, packing his tools. I paid him in cash, walked him to the door, thanked him for his efficiency. Wilder had retreated to the kitchen, but I could feel him watching from the doorway as I returned to test the study lock myself. I pressed my thumb to the sensor. The green light flashed. The mechanism clicked open. I pushed the door wide. On my desk, clearly visible from the hallway, sat Elaine's leather-bound diary. I'd placed it there deliberately that morning, angled so anyone standing where Wilder was standing would see it perfectly. The small book with his mother's handwriting on the cover, her name inscribed in the careful script she'd used for everything important. I saw his reflection in the study window, saw him take a step forward, saw his hands start to rise. "Is that..." he began. I stepped inside and closed the door. The lock engaged with its electronic beep and mechanical click. He saw it. Good. Let him wonder what his mother wrote. I stood on the other side of the door listening, heard him standing there for a long moment, heard him try the handle once gently, as if testing whether I might have left it unlocked by accident. The handle didn't move. The lock held. Finally, his footsteps retreated upstairs. I sat down at my desk and looked at the diary I'd been avoiding for 12 months. I'd found it in Elaine's mechanical toolbox 3 weeks after the funeral, hidden beneath her collection of screwdrivers and Allen wrenches. She had always kept her most important things in that toolbox. Her father's old drill, the house deed, her mother's wedding ring. And apparently I'd been too afraid to open it then, too afraid of what she might have written in the final months, too afraid that her words would make her absence more permanent. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Anger had burned through fear like fire through paper. I opened the diary. The leather binding creaked. The pages smelled like her lavender and tea. The first entry was dated 6 months before she died. I read Elaine's diary that weekend. Every entry, every word about our son that she'd been too kind to say out loud while she was alive. By Sunday morning, I was ready for the next escalation. The sticky note on my refrigerator door said, "Our food don't touch," in Paloma's looping handwriting. I stood in the kitchen with my morning tea reading those 4 words. Our food. In my kitchen, in my house, using my electricity. Interesting choice of words. I opened the refrigerator. Paloma had filled it completely organic yogurt, expensive cheeses, pre-cut vegetables in plastic containers, imported sparkling water, grass-fed butter. Everything arranged with the territorial precision of someone marking their domain. My own groceries had been pushed to the back, a carton of milk, some eggs left over rice. I closed the door gently, didn't remove the note, didn't touch her food, didn't say a word. Instead, I pulled out my phone and ordered a premium Samsung mini fridge for my study. Same-day delivery. It arrived that afternoon at 3. The delivery men brought it up the front steps while Paloma was out shopping, probably buying more things to claim ownership of. I had them place it in my study next to my desk, plugged it in, stocked it with Longjing, tea fresh milk, and a week's worth of simple groceries. Everything I needed. Then I walked back to the kitchen and unplugged the large refrigerator. The motor's hum died. The light inside went dark. I didn't announce it, didn't leave a note, just quietly pulled the plug and went to my study, locking the door behind me with my fingerprint. You want to claim territory, fine, but I control the electricity. Monday morning, I woke to the sound of Paloma's voice rising through the walls. Your father unplugged the fridge. Everything is ruined. What is wrong with him? I sat in my study sipping tea from my personal mini fridge, listening to her describe the damage over the phone to Wilder. The yogurt had separated, the produce had wilted, the expensive cheese had begun to smell. 12 hours without power had destroyed hundreds of dollars of groceries she'd claimed belonged to her. Natural consequences. Physics didn't care about sticky notes. I heard her stomp upstairs, heard a door slam, heard nothing else. I finished my tea in silence. 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening in mid-December, Paloma's parents arrived unannounced. I heard the doorbell heard, Wilder's enthusiastic greeting, heard the sound of rolling suitcases on my hardwood floor. Mom, Dad, come in, let me show you to the guest room. I stayed in the kitchen finishing my dinner, listened to the footsteps move through the house toward the downstairs guest room, listened to the moment when everything changed, the sound of a door handle rattling, the electronic beep of the fingerprint lock refusing entry. Dad. What, the guest room is locked? I set down my chopsticks, stood up, and walked into the hallway. Richard Caldwell stood there with 2 rolling suitcases, 57 years old, an insurance adjuster from Orange County with thinning hair, and the confident bearing of a man used to being the authority in his daughter's life. Beside him, Susan Caldwell, 56. His wife carried a small overnight bag and wore the practiced smile of someone who smoothed over her husband's bluntness at dinner parties. They both looked at me. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," I said, holding my teacup. "Unfortunately, there's no room available downstairs. The upstairs has a pull-out couch." Richard blinked. "I'm sorry." "The guest room," Wilder said, gesturing at the locked door. "It's locked. Dad, can you unlock it?" I took a sip of tea. "I don't think so." Susan's smile wavered. "Oh, we don't want to impose. We assumed. Paloma said you had space." "Did she?" I looked at my daughter-in-law, who'd appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed. "The couch upstairs should accommodate you both. Dinner is at 6 if you'd like to join." I walked back to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Richard whisper something to Susan, heard Wilder's awkward laugh, heard the sound of suitcases being dragged up the stairs instead of rolling smoothly into the comfortable guest room with the queen bed and private bathroom. The pull-out couch upstairs was narrow old and positioned in the corner of Wilder and Paloma's cramped living space. Not meant for guests, meant for emergencies. This wasn't an emergency. This was a lesson. Dinner that evening was quiet. I'd made a simple meal, rice stir-fried vegetables, steamed fish. Enough for 5, but nothing elaborate. Nothing that suggested I'd been expecting company or felt obligated to impress. Richard sat across from me, Susan beside him. Wilder and Paloma flanked them like anxious translators at a diplomatic incident. "So," Richard said, attempting conversation, "Paloma tells us you've been making some changes around the house." "As standard maintenance," I said, serving myself rice. Susan tried next. "It's such a lovely home. You and Elaine built something beautiful here." "We did," I said, "thank you." Paloma pushed food around her plate. Wilder drank water like it was medicine. Richard watched me carefully now. I could see his adjuster's mind working, reassessing the situation he'd walked into. His daughter had told him one story, probably about her generous father-in-law, who was happy to house them, who loved having family around, who was just a little old-fashioned and set in his ways. But the locked doors told a different story. The mini fridge in my study told a different story. The pull-out couch told a different story. I saw the exact moment Richard Caldwell understood his daughter had married poorly. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes moved from me to Wilder to Paloma and back to me. The confident bearing deflated slightly. The assumption of welcome evaporated. He set down his fork. "Wilder," he said slowly, "you mentioned you were living here temporarily. How long has it been now?" "Spofond. Wilder cleared his throat. About a year." "A year," Richard repeated. "We've been saving up," Paloma said quickly. "Looking for the right place." Richard looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that evening. Then he glanced at Wilder, then at his daughter, then back at me. The expression on his face was one I recognized from my years in engineering, the look of a man who just realized he'd been reading the blueprint upside down. "I see," he said quietly. We finished dinner in silence. They left early the next morning, without breakfast. I watched the Caldwells drive away Saturday morning, without saying goodbye. Their car disappeared down the street at 7:15 earlier than any guest should feel compelled to leave. By 8, I was standing in my garage surveying the problem I'd tolerated for 4 months. The garage looked like a storage unit had exploded Wilder's kingdom of junk and my F-150, sitting outside in the rain for the 4th month straight. Old tires stacked against the wall, a broken toolbox missing its lid, a rusted bicycle he'd promised to fix last summer, unopened Amazon boxes containing impulse purchases he'd forgotten about, gym equipment he'd used exactly twice before deciding fitness was too inconvenient. All of it crammed into the space where my truck belonged, while my vehicle weathered December rain in the driveway. Not anymore. I pulled out my phone and called a professional tow service. Tony Fletcher arrived at 9 with his crew and industrial tow truck. He was stocky in his 40s with efficient movements and the neutral expression of someone who'd cleared 100 contentious garages. He walked through the space once assessing the volume. "All of it," he asked. "Everything," I said. "Move it to the uncovered area in the side yard." "Not covered storage." "No, the yard." He nodded. Didn't ask why. Professionals don't ask why. They worked systematically. 2 men with hand trucks and moving blankets loading everything onto the tow truck bed, then relocating it to the side yard where it would sit exposed to December sun and eventual weather. Not covered, not protected, just moved. Wilder came running out halfway through the operation, still in his pajamas, face flushed. "Dad, what are you doing?" "My stuff." "Where are they taking my things?" I stood near the garage entrance, hands in my pockets, watching the crew work. "To the side yard," I said. "Uncovered. Next time you leave things in the yard, it's free. This time cost $180. I handed him the itemized receipt Tony had given me. Wilder stared at it. "You're charging me for this?" "Tony charged me. I'm passing the cost to you. Your junk, your expense." "You can't just, this is my garage," I said. "My truck. Been parked outside for 4 months. Not anymore." He looked at the receipt again, then at me, then at his belongings being systematically removed from the space he'd claimed without asking. Something in his face shifted, confusion giving way to the first hint of real understanding. For 4 months my truck sat in the rain, while his junk stayed dry. Not anymore. By 10:30, the garage was empty. I walked my F-150 inside, centered it perfectly in the space, and locked the rolling door with a new padlock. The key went on my personal keyring, the only keyring. Outside, Wilder's belongings sat in a pile in the side yard, fully visible from the street. I didn't feel guilty. I felt efficient. The next day, Sunday at noon, I sat at the outdoor patio table reading the newspaper. Wilder was nearby, smoking nervously, glancing at his belongings, still piled where the tow crew had left them 24 hours earlier. I placed a thick white envelope on the table between us. Didn't look up from the newspaper. He stared at it. "What's this?" he asked. "Read it," I said. "Decide by Tuesday evening." He opened the envelope slowly, pulled out the document I'd spent Friday afternoon preparing with a real estate attorney, a formal typed rental agreement on proper letterhead. I watched his face as he read. Monthly rent, $2,800 for the upstairs bedroom and shared common areas. Orange County market rate for comparable space. Initial term, 3 months. Utilities tenant responsible for proportional usage above baseline. Security deposit first and last month in advance. The final paragraph was the important one. Failure to execute this agreement within 48 hours constitutes notice of tenant's intent to vacate. Landlord reserves the right to require full vacancy within 14 days per California Civil Code, Section 1946. "Dad, we can't afford that you're charging us rent. Your own son." I looked up from the newspaper for the first time. My own son has been living rent-free in a $1.1 million house for 13 months. The grace period is over. But we don't have... You're an adult, I said. I treat you like an adult. Read it. Decide by Tuesday evening. I folded the newspaper, stood up, and walked toward the house. If this isn't fair, he said behind me. I paused at the door, looked back over my shoulder. That's fair, I said. You started a live stream of me crawling under my truck and called me your unpaid servant. You stole my tools and sold them. You filled my refrigerator with your food and told me not to touch it. You occupied my garage for 4 months while my vehicle sat in the rain. You never once asked if I needed help, if I was okay, if I was lonely in this house after your mother died. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Fair. I continued. Would have been you offering to pay rent 13 months ago. Fair would have been you respecting the fact that I was grieving and needed space, not freeloaders. This isn't about fair. This is about reality. You want to live here? You pay. You don't want to pay. You leave. You have 48 hours. I walked inside and closed the door. Blood doesn't entitle you to a house. Money does. I went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. While the water heated, I stood at the window looking out at the yard. Wilder was still sitting at the patio table, the rental agreement in his hands, reading it again, like he was searching for a loophole that didn't exist. Then he pulled out his phone. I could hear his voice through the open window, shaky and urgent. You need to come home right now. He gave me a rental contract, $2,800 a month. He's serious. A pause, Paloma responding on the other end. I don't know what we're gonna do. Just come home. His voice was shaking. I poured my tea, walked to the study, and closed the door. I sat in my study that evening, with the rental agreement deadline ticking down, but I couldn't focus on whether Wilder would sign. My mind kept circling back to the things Elaine had written in her diary, the entries I'd been too afraid to read for 12 months. At 2 a.m, Monday night, I woke to darkness and the sound of my son whispering into a phone on the stairs. Well, and give me 2 more weeks. I'd gotten up for water thirsty from the tea I'd drunk too late. The hallway was dark except for the dim glow from Wilder's phone screen, illuminating his face 3 steps up from the bottom. I told you, he whispered, urgent and desperate. I'm handling it. Please, just 2 more weeks. I froze in the hallway. He hadn't seen me yet. I know what I said, I know. But my father, it's complicated. I need more time. His voice had a quality I'd never heard before. Not anger, not entitlement, fear. I shifted my weight. The floorboard creaked. Wilder spun around, saw my shadow in the darkness, and dropped the phone. It clattered down 2 steps, landing face up on the hardwood. The screen stayed lit. I could see it clearly from where I stood, an unknown number with no contact name, and below that, a message preview. You have 3 weeks, then we come to the house. Wilder scrambled down the steps, snatched up the phone, and held it against his chest. The light disappeared. The hallway went dark again. Just a friend, Dad, he said, forcing a smile I couldn't quite see but could hear in his voice. Sorry if I woke you. I looked at where the phone had been, where that message had glowed for 3 seconds. 3 weeks. Then we come to the house. My house. Couldn't sleep, I said. You should get some rest. He nodded, still clutching the phone, and hurried back upstairs. I stood in the dark hallway for a long time. The phone number from that screen burned into my memory. Then I got my water and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. 3 weeks. They were coming to my house in 3 weeks. Tuesday morning, I unlocked my study with my fingerprint. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across my desk. I opened the locked drawer where I kept important documents, my passport, the house deed, Elaine's wedding ring, and her diary. The leather was soft, worn from her hands. I'd found it in her mechanical toolbox 3 weeks after the funeral, hidden beneath her father's old drill and a collection of Allen wrenches. She'd always kept her most precious things there, mixed with tools so no one would think to look. I'd been too afraid to open it for 12 months, too afraid of what her final words might say, too afraid that reading them would make her absence permanent. But fear had been replaced by something colder now, something that needed answers. I opened to the first page, her handwriting careful and deliberate. If something happens to me, give this to Arthur. I love you. Take care of yourself. Arthur was my name written in her gentle hand, our intimate name, the one she'd used when we were alone. I turned the page. The entries were dated 6 months before she died, spring of last year when I'd still thought we had decades ahead of us. April 3rd, Wilder. Forgot to bring my medication again today. 3rd time this month. He said the pharmacy was closed, but I called they were open until 9 p.m. I don't understand why he keeps forgetting. April 15th, Wilder wants me to sign new insurance papers. He says the current coverage isn't enough, that I should increase it for his future for grandchildren we might have. The coverage is already $200,000. I don't see why we need more, but he said if I don't sign, he won't come home anymore. I stopped reading, looked up at the window. The morning light had gotten brighter, but the room felt darker. $200,000, but I'd seen the insurance company's letter after she died. The payout had been $750,000. She'd signed. Eventually she'd signed. I kept reading. As May 2nd, another argument about the insurance today. I told Wilder, I'm not comfortable raising it that high. He got very angry, said I don't trust him, said I never believed in him. He left without saying goodbye. I feel guilty, but I also feel afraid. Why does he need me to sign this? May 20th, I signed the new insurance policy. Wilder was so happy. He hugged me and said I was the best mother in the world. I want to believe that's true, but I can't shake this feeling that something is wrong. My hands were shaking. I set the diary down, took a breath, picked it up again. The final readable entry was dated June 8th, 6 months before she died. Today my head is very dizzy. I asked Wilder for my pills, the blood pressure medication Dr. Morrison prescribed. He looked at me strangely and said, I'm getting forgetful that I already took them this morning. I'm not sure anymore. Maybe I did, but I don't remember. Everything feels foggy lately. I'm scared something is wrong with me. There were a few more entries after that, but the handwriting deteriorated. Words misspelled, sentences incomplete. The careful script I'd known for 30 years, dissolving into something confused and uncertain. The last page just said, Arthur, I love you, I'm sorry. I closed the diary. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They'd gone completely still the way they did when I was working with precision tools, when steady hands meant the difference between fixing something and breaking it forever. I'd been mourning my wife for 12 months. I might have been mourning a murder. The medication, the insurance pressure, the confusion about whether she'd taken her pills. And 6 months later, she'd collapsed in the hospital hallway and never woken up. I locked the diary back in the drawer, sat at my desk for 20 minutes without moving. The phone call at 2 a.m., the threatening message about coming to the house, the insurance arguments, the forgotten medication. I looked at the clock, 8:47 a.m. Then I picked up my phone and called Sherman Whitaker, a private investigator Ralph had mentioned months ago, when I'd casually asked about legal options for tenant disputes. I needed to know what $750,000 in life insurance looked like on paper. Sherman answered on the second ring. We agreed to meet at 3 that afternoon, at a Vietnamese cafe in Westminster he knew would be quiet. I arrived early, ordered tea I didn't drink, waited. Sherman Whitaker walked in at exactly 3 o'clock. He was 62, a retired private investigator with sharp gray eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years separating lies from truth. We'd known each other for decades. He'd helped Ralph with a property dispute 5 years ago, and Ralph had mentioned him again recently when I'd asked about tenant law. He sat across from me in the corner booth, ordered Vietnamese coffee and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. The TikTok live stream calling me an unpaid servant, the tools Wilder had stolen and sold, the refrigerator war, the rental agreement with its 48-hour deadline, the in-laws' uncomfortable visit, the 2 a.m. phone call with the threatening message about coming to my house in 3 weeks. And then I told him about Elaine's diary, the entries about forgotten medication, the pressure to raise life insurance, the confusion about whether she'd taken her pills, the final page that just said she was sorry. Sherman listened without interrupting his coffee, sitting untouched between his hands. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and asked the question that changed everything. How much life insurance did Wilder receive when your wife died? $750,000, I said. He signed for it 11 days after the funeral. Sherman leaned back in the booth. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, the look of a professional who just heard a pattern he recognized. And you never wondered, he said slowly, why your son begged your wife to raise the coverage from $200,000 to $750,000 exactly 6 months before she died. The cafe's ambient noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of other conversations seemed to fade away. I stopped, started again. I thought he was being responsible, planning ahead. He told me it was for their future, for grandchildren we might have someday. 6 months, Sherman said. That's how long you plan a murder if you're patient. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun I hadn't realized was fired. You think he killed her? I said. It wasn't a question. I think the timeline is suspicious, Sherman said carefully. I think pressure to increase life insurance followed by medication irregularities, followed by sudden death, followed by immediate payout, is a pattern I've seen in 3 homicide cases over my career. I think you should let me look into this properly before you draw conclusions. But yes, I think it's possible. I wrapped my hands around my teacup. It had gone cold. What do? I asked. Nothing, Sherman said. You do nothing different. Keep the rental agreement in place. Keep your distance. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Let me pull the insurance records, the medical files from her hospital, stay the prescription history. If there's evidence of foul play, we find it quietly and bring it to someone with a badge. If there's not, you learn to live with doubt. But you don't confront him. Not yet. I nodded slowly. What in the phone call? I asked. The threat about coming to the house. That's separate, Sherman said. That sounds like loan sharks. Gambling debt, probably. The timeline matches. He gets $750,000, burns through it in a year, borrows more when he can't sustain the lifestyle. Now he's being squeezed. How much do you think he has left? Nothing, I said. He couldn't even pay for gas when I canceled his credit card. Then he owes someone dangerous a lot of money he doesn't have, and they know where he lives. Where I live, I corrected. Sherman nodded. Where you live? We sat in silence for a moment. I'll start with the insurance company, Sherman said. Give me 3 days. I left the cafe at 4:30 with a plan I hadn't had that morning and a suspicion I couldn't unthink. 2 days later, Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, exactly 48 hours after the rental agreement deadline, Wilder knocked on my study door. I opened it to find him standing in the hallway with the signed contract in his hand and his head bowed like a penitent son. I'm sorry about the video, Dad, he said. It was stupid, disrespectful. I'll delete it if you want. Here's the contract. Signed. He handed me the thick envelope. Both signatures were there, his and Paloma's, witnessed and dated. And I examined the document carefully. Everything was in order. Rent is due the 1st of next month, I said. $2,800 plus your share of utilities. About the amount, he said, could we maybe discuss? That's market rate, I said. Non-negotiable. He nodded, swallowed. Okay, we'll make it work. I looked at my son standing in my hallway apologizing for a live stream while I was investigating whether he'd murdered his mother for money. The cognitive dissonance was almost funny. You apologized for the live stream, I thought. But I'm investigating something you never apologized for. Thank you for understanding, he said. I nodded, started to close the door. His phone rang. The sound cut through the moment like a blade. I watched his face as he pulled it from his pocket and looked at the screen. Watched the color drain from his skin like someone had opened a tap. Watched his expression shift from contrition to pure fear in less than a second. I need to take this, he stammered. He turned and rushed toward the front door, already answering. I told you I'd have it, I heard him say as he pushed through to the yard. Please just give me until... The door closed behind him. I walked back to my study window and watched. He paced the yard with the phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing frantically. Even from inside, I could see the panic in his movements. The fear. He signed my rental agreement like a man confessing to jaywalking while hiding a body in his trunk. He'd apologized for the live stream. He'd signed my contract. He'd bowed his head and played the role of reformed son. But his face when that phone rang, that was the face of a man with debts far worse than $2,800 a month. And I was about to find out exactly how deep those debts ran. Sherman called me the next morning. Come to my office, he said. I found something. Friday morning, Sherman placed a photocopy of the life insurance policy face up on his desk. Between us, $750,000 beneficiary Wilder Stafford, signed for 11 days after I buried my wife. I'd known about the payout. What I hadn't known was what came before it. Sherman flipped to the second page. Coverage increase application. Dated exactly 5 months before she died. Raised the policy from $200,000 to $750,000. Look at the authorized signature line. I leaned forward. Elaine's signature was there in what looked like her careful handwriting. The loops on the E and the S matched. The slant was right. At first glance, it looked authentic. That looks like her handwriting, I said. But she never mentioned this. Never. Look closer, Sherman said, handing me a magnifying glass. Look at the pressure points, the hesitation marks here and here. I studied the signature under magnification, saw what he was pointing to tiny tremors in the ink where someone had paused mid-stroke. Pressure variations that suggested tracing rather than natural writing. The signature looked right, but the physics of how it was made were wrong. As someone traced this very carefully, Sherman said. The insurance company accepted it because it looked close enough for their verification process. But this wasn't her signature. I set down the magnifying glass. That she never signed financial documents without telling me, I said. 30 years of marriage. We discussed everything. She would have mentioned increasing coverage by more than $500,000. The diary says he pressured her about insurance, Sherman said. But she was resisting. Then suddenly, 5 months before she dies, there's an application with her signature raising the coverage to exactly what he wanted. A signature she never told you about because she never actually signed it. 5 months of planning. That's premeditation. What do I do with this? I asked. Nothing yet, Sherman said. Insurance fraud from a year ago is one thing, but if we can prove he forged this and then caused her death to collect, that's murder for financial gain. That's different. I'm still pulling medical records, talking to hospital staff who were there when she died. Give me more time. I nodded, took a photo of the document with my phone, went home. That night I couldn't sleep. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Elaine signing documents she never signed, taking pills she might not have needed, dying in a hospital while our son waited for money. At 11, I gave up on sleep and went to my study. My email notification chimed. Message from Sherman with a PDF attachment and a subject line that made my blood go cold. Found this in county records. The body of the email was short. Mortgage loan application, $180,000, your house as collateral. Check the co-signer line. Call me when you see it. I opened the PDF. Mortgage loan application for $180,000. Property listed as collateral, my Westminster house valued at $1.1 million. Application dated 8 months prior, 4 months before Elaine died. I scrolled to the co-signer section. Arthur Stafford, in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't. I walked to my filing cabinet, pulled out my actual signature from a dozen documents, compared them side by side on my desk. The forgery was good, better than the insurance signature. Whoever had practiced this had studied my handwriting carefully, the capital C. The way I crossed my T, the final flourish on the dow, all there, close enough to fool a bank's initial verification. But it wasn't mine. I'd never signed this, never authorized this loan, never received the $180,000 that this document claimed I'd borrowed against my house. I scrolled to the second page. Bank processing status. Pending final verification, 60 days remaining before foreclosure proceedings. I read it 3 times. Not 60 days remaining until approval, 60 days remaining until they foreclose. The loan had already been processed. The money had already been distributed. The bank was in the final verification stage before beginning foreclosure proceedings if the loan wasn't resolved. My son had forged my signature to take out a $180,000 loan using my house as collateral. And in 60 days, if I couldn't prove it was fraud, the bank would take my house to recover their money. I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at my own name in handwriting that wasn't mine. The insurance fraud had given him $750,000. This mortgage fraud had given him another $180,000, nearly $1 million total, extracted through forgery and possibly murder. And the threatening phone call. You have 3 weeks, then we come to the house. He'd burned through all of it. $1 million in 13 months. And now someone dangerous wanted payment he couldn't give. And my house, the house Elaine and I had built together, was collateral for debts on 2 different fronts. I had 60 days to prove my son tried to murder his mother, or I'd lose my house to his fraud. I picked up my phone to call Sherman, then realized it was past midnight. I'd call him in the morning, start the process of proving forgery, challenge the mortgage, protect the house. 60 days. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a calendar, counted backwards from the date on the bank's status report. Today was mid-December. 60 days put the deadline in mid-February. I took a red pen and circled February 15th. Then I looked at the forged signature again, my name in someone else's hand, authorizing a loan I never approved for money I never received. Elaine's diary had said, "If something happens to me." She'd known to be afraid. She'd documented the medication irregularities, the insurance pressure, the confusion. She'd left me evidence because she'd suspected what I now knew. Our son wasn't just a disappointment. He was a criminal. Monday morning, 8 days into the countdown, Sherman called and told me to meet him at County Medical Center. I found the nurse who was there when Elaine died, he said. She needs to see you. We met in the hallway outside the intensive care unit. The smell of antiseptic and institutional cleaning solution hung in the air, triggering memories of the last time I'd walked these corridors, the night they called to tell me Elaine was gone. Priscilla Lambert approached us with visible reluctance. She was 55, a head nurse with kind eyes, steady hands, and the weary professionalism of someone who'd watched too many patients die under questionable circumstances. Sherman made introductions. She nodded politely but kept her distance. "I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish," she said. "I remember your wife. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't want to get involved in family matters." Sherman reached into his briefcase and pulled out Elaine's diary, set it on the small table in the hallway between us. Then the photocopied insurance documents. "This isn't about family," he said quietly. "Look at the handwriting." Priscilla glanced down, saw Elaine's careful script on the diary cover. Her professional mask slipped for just a second. I saw recognition, then something that looked like guilt. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My wife's toolbox," I said. "She hid it there. The entries are from 6 months before she died, about her medication being managed by our son, about insurance pressure, about confusion regarding whether she'd taken her pills." Priscilla's face had gone pale. "Come with me," she said. She led us to a private conference room off the main hallway, locked the door behind us, sat down heavily in one of the institutional chairs. "I need to get her file," she said. "Wait here." She returned 10 minutes later with a manila folder, Elaine's medical record from her final hospital stay. "I shouldn't be showing you this," she said, opening the folder. "But if what I think happened actually happened, you need to know." She flipped to a page near the back, pointed to a handwritten notation in the margins dated 3 days before Elaine died. "Warfarin blood level critically low, 40% below prescribed dose. Patient claims son manages medication at home. Recommend immediate adjustment and family counseling regarding medication compliance." I read it twice. "Warfarin is a blood thinner," Priscilla said. "Your wife was on it for her heart condition. The therapeutic level has to be maintained very carefully. Too much causes bleeding, too little causes clots." "It's 40% below prescribed dose," Sherman said. "What would cause that?" "Not taking it," Priscilla said, "or someone not giving it to her when they said they were." She wrote it down. A nurse saw it happening and wrote it down, and nobody listened. "I noted this to the attending physician," Priscilla continued. "He dismissed it, said elderly patients forget their medication all the time, that it was probably simple non-compliance. He increased the dose during her hospital stay and moved on." "But you didn't think it was simple non-compliance," I said. Priscilla looked at me directly for the first time. "Your son visited every morning," she said. "Like clockwork, 7:30 a.m. before most family members are even awake. He'd go into her room for 20 minutes, then leave. I noticed because it was so consistent." "What did you notice about those visits?" Sherman asked. "Your wife always seemed more tired afterward," Priscilla said. "More confused. I mentioned it once to the attending. He said it was probably emotional stress from seeing family, that some patients get overwhelmed by visitors." She closed the folder. Her hands rested on top of it steady despite what she was telling us. "I've been a nurse for 32 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of patients die, natural causes, accidents, complications. You develop instincts, and my instincts told me something was wrong with your son's visits, but instincts aren't evidence. The attending physician had more seniority, so I documented what I could and let it go." "You did your job," I said. She shook her head. "If I'd done my job, I would have pushed harder. I would have asked for a toxicology screen. I would have questioned why a 32-year-old son was managing his mother's medication instead of letting nursing staff handle it during her hospital stay. He was managing it during her hospital stay." Sherman's voice had gone very quiet. "He told us he was a pharmacist," Priscilla said. "Said he had medical training, that he wanted to coordinate her care with her home regimen. The attending approved it because it reduced nursing workload. I should have verified his credentials. I didn't." I thought about Wilder, about the various jobs he'd mentioned over the years: retail, real estate, marketing. Never once had he claimed to be a pharmacist. "What happened the day she died?" I asked. Priscilla was quiet for a long moment. "She coded at 4 in the morning, she said. Massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to her lungs, consistent with someone whose blood thinner levels had been critically low for an extended period. We tried to resuscitate for 18 minutes. She didn't make it. She paused. We called your son at 6 a.m. He arrived at 7. I was there when we gave him the news. Another pause, this one longer. When she died, Priscilla said finally, very quietly, your son. He didn't cry. The conference room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I remember that, she continued, because I found it strange. I've told hundreds of people their loved ones have died. The reactions vary: shock, anger, denial, collapse. But there's always emotion. Always. No one loses their mother without crying. She looked at me directly, but he just stood there, nodding, processing, asking about paperwork, about when he could collect her belongings, about the death certificate timeline. Very calm, very organized. And I remember thinking, this man just lost his mother, and he's asking about administrative procedures, like he's closing a business transaction. Grief looks like a lot of things, but it never looks like nothing. He planned it, I said. Priscilla didn't answer, but she didn't disagree. I sat in that sterile hospital conference room with my wife's medical file open in front of me, and Priscilla Lambert's words echoed in my head. He didn't cry, the critically low warfarin levels, the forged insurance signature, the morning visits, the diary entries about forgotten medication, and no tears. My son had killed his mother, and I could prove it. Proving it and living with it were different things. I drove home from the hospital that Monday afternoon, with Priscilla Lambert's words echoing in my head. He didn't cry. The evidence existed. But walking through my front door knowing my son was a murderer felt like entering a crime scene I'd been living in for a year. I heard someone crying in my kitchen and for a moment thought it was a ghost until I realized it was my daughter-in-law, and she thought she was alone. Paloma sat at the kitchen table with her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. She didn't hear me enter. I could have walked away, gone to my study, let her cry in private. Instead, I filled the kettle. The sound of running water made her look up, startled, wiping her face quickly. I didn't know you were home, she said. I didn't answer, just poured 2 cups of tea when the water boiled and sat down across from her, pushed 1 cup toward her without speaking. We sat in silence. The kitchen clock ticked. Wilder said the money was from family inheritance, she said finally. He said you'd agreed to share it with him, so we could build our life together. I set my teacup down carefully. No one told you that, I said. No one asked you if that's what you wanted to build your life on. Her hands tightened around her cup. Then where did it come from? She asked. I studied her face, saw genuine ignorance there. She'd been living on blood money for a year and thought it was a gift. Sometimes the victim and the accomplice are the same person. I can't tell you, I said. Not yet, because the answer would ruin your life. She looked up at me, then really looked, and I saw the moment she understood that whatever the truth was, it was worse than anything she'd imagined. Am I in danger? She whispered. And not from me, I said. We sat there for another few minutes in silence. Then she stood, washed her cup, dried it, and put it back exactly where I'd taken it from. Thank you for the tea, she said. She walked upstairs without looking back. That night I couldn't sleep. Tuesday at 10 p.m. day, 9 of the countdown. I went to my study and took out Elaine's diary. I'd read parts of it before, but there were pages I'd avoided, later entries, the ones written in the hospital in the final weeks. I read them now. November 28th. Today my head is very dizzy. I asked Wilder to get my medicine, but he said I'm getting forgetful that I already took them. I'm not sure anymore. December 1st. Wilder visits every morning at 7:30. The nurses let him handle my medications because he told them he's a pharmacist. I don't remember him being a pharmacist. December 3rd. I wanted to call Arthur, but the phone in this room has no signal. Strange. It worked just last month when the nurse let me use it. I asked Wilder to bring me his phone, but he said the hospital doesn't allow cell phones in ICU. But I see other patients using theirs. She knew. She tried to call me. He blocked the phone. My hands shook. I set the diary down, breathed, picked it up again. The final entry was dated December 6th, 2 days before she died. The handwriting was shaky, sloping, barely legible. Arthur, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I don't think I'm going to leave this hospital. I think our son is doing something to me, but I can't prove it, and no one believes me when I try to say it. I love you. Take care of yourself. Always. E. I closed the diary, sat in my study in complete darkness, didn't turn on the lamp, just sat there with my wife's final words in my hands and the knowledge that she'd known she was dying and couldn't reach me. The clock showed 11:47 p.m. I sat through midnight, through 1 a.m., through 2. Thought about Elaine writing those words while our son blocked her phone and managed her medication into fatal blood clot territory. Thought about Paloma crying in my kitchen over money she thought was a gift. Thought about the rental agreement making my son my tenant while I investigated him for murder. Thought about Ralph telling me a year was long enough to stop being blind. Thought about Elaine's red rook sitting untouched on the chessboard exactly where she'd left it the night before she went to the hospital. At 3 a.m., Wednesday morning, I looked at my calendar. 51 days remaining. 51 days to prove forgery and murder or lose my house. I turned on the desk lamp. The sudden light felt like violence after hours of darkness. I picked up my phone and called Sherman. He answered on the third ring voice, groggy. "It's 3 in the morning. I need you to trace a phone number," I said. "The one that called Wilder at 2 a.m., the one with the threat about coming to my house." "I'm already working on it," Sherman said. "I work faster," I said. "I need to know who he owes money to and how much. I need to know if they're connected to the insurance fraud. I need to know everything." There was a pause. "Are you okay?" Sherman asked. "No," I said, "but I will be when this is finished." I hung up. Sat in my study at 3 a.m., with Elaine's diary closed on the desk in front of me. 51 days left to prove what I now knew with absolute certainty. It was time to find out who was calling my son at 2 a.m. with threats. Sherman called me back at 9 Wednesday morning. "Come to my office," he said. "You need to see this in person." Wednesday morning, Sherman slid a single sheet of paper across his desk toward me. The phone number from Wilder's 2 a.m. call traced to a shell company the FBI had been watching for 6 months. "Shell company," Sherman said, pointing to the document. "Registered front for a loan shark operation. FBI's been monitoring them for 6 months. Your son owes $280,000. He paid $150,000 right after the insurance cleared last year." I did the math. So he collected $750,000 from insurance, paid $150,000 immediately, and still owes $130,000? "That's $600,000 in 13 months, Sherman said. "Plus whatever he borrowed on that forged mortgage. He's burning through nearly $1 million in a little over a year." I thought about the designer clothes, the BMW, the lifestyle Wilder and Paloma had maintained while living rent-free in my house. The threatening message, I said, "We come to the house in 3 weeks. That's standard loan shark enforcement. Después. This standard Sherman confirmed. But here's the problem." He flipped the page, showed me a photocopy of what looked like a loan application. "Look at the contact address they have on file for collection," he said. I read it. "My Westminster address, my house." He gave them your address, Arthur. When they say they're coming to the house, they mean your house, your property. He listed your $1.1 million home as his primary residence for debt collection purposes. My son gave criminals my address. My house was his collateral. "So when they can't find him," I said slowly, "they come here." "And that's how it works," Sherman said. "They don't care whose name is on the deed. They care where their debtor lives. And according to this paperwork, Wilder Stafford lives at your address." I sat back in my chair. "He didn't just steal from me," I said. "He put a target on my house." "Worse," Sherman said. "These aren't street thugs. This is an FBI-monitored operation. If they come to your house for collection and you're there, you could get caught up in federal surveillance. Your name in FBI reports, your property photographed, questions about whether you're involved." "I'm not involved," I said. "You think federal prosecutors care? They see a father and son at the same address, one owing money to organized crime. They start asking questions about family business, about where the money went, about who knew what." I looked at the document again, my address in black and white attached to my son's debt to criminals. "What do?" I asked. "Document everything," Sherman said. "The rental agreement you already have helps proves you're his landlord, not his partner. Keep distance, and pray they don't knock on your door in the next 48 days. I drove home thinking about loan sharks with my address and FBI surveillance potentially photographing my house. 2 days later, Friday morning, day 12 of the countdown, Sherman called again. "We have a bigger problem," he said. I was in my study, closed the door. The FBI has had Wilder's name for 3 months, Sherman said. Not as a debtor, as someone who reported the loan sharks. What? He filed a report claiming the loan sharks were pressuring him into insurance fraud, trying to frame them for forcing him to forge his mother's signature and increase her coverage. I sat down heavily. He's playing both sides, I said. The criminals and the FBI. All sides, Sherman said, including you. My source at the Bureau says Wilder's been cooperative, giving them information about the loan shark operation, positioning himself as a victim who was coerced into fraud to pay gambling debts. But he committed the fraud before he owed them money, I said. The insurance increase was 5 months before Elaine died. The gambling debts came after. You know that, I know that. But the FBI doesn't have the medical records yet. They don't have your wife's diary. All they have is Wilder's story about being pressured by dangerous criminals into forging documents. I looked at Elaine's diary sitting in my locked drawer. He's setting up a defense, I said. Worse, Sherman said. If he feels trapped by your investigation, Arthur, he might try to use you as the fall guy, report you to save himself, claim you knew about the insurance fraud, claim you were complicit, anything to shift blame when the evidence starts closing in. A man who plays everyone eventually plays himself, but he takes you down with him. What do? I asked. The same thing I told you before. Document everything. Keep the diary secured. Keep your distance from him. And whatever you do, don't let him know you're investigating. If he realizes you have evidence that contradicts his FBI story, he becomes dangerous. He already is dangerous, I said. He killed his mother. Different kind of dangerous, Sherman said. Corner dangerous, self-preservation dangerous, the kind that makes people do desperate things. I hung up, sat in my study, thinking about my son playing the FBI, the loan sharks, and his own father all at once. Then I stood up and walked to my bedroom door, pressed my thumb to the fingerprint scanner, and watched it unlock. I went into the settings, changed the authorized fingerprint, deleted the old code, registered a new one, walked down the hall to the study door, did the same thing. The first time I changed these locks, it was to keep my son out of my private space, to reclaim territory he'd claimed without asking. This time it was to protect myself from what he might do when he realized I was closing in. To protect the diary, the insurance documents, the medical records, all the evidence that proved his FBI story was a lie. Because if Wilder discovered what I had, he wouldn't just manipulate authorities. He'd try to destroy me to save himself. I tested both locks twice. Made sure they responded only to my new fingerprint. Made sure nothing from before would open them now. 48 days left on the countdown, and my son was more dangerous than I'd imagined. Dangerous required evidence, and I was running out of time to gather it. Monday morning, day 15. Sherman called me to his office for a meeting with Priscilla Lambert. She arrived carrying a manila envelope, her nurse's professionalism barely masking the anxiety underneath. Sherman and I sat across from her as she slid the envelope across his desk toward me. I wrote this the day she died, she said. I opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of Elaine's medical file, the same one she'd shown us before. But this copy had additional pages notes Priscilla had kept separately outside the official hospital record. My personal documentation, she explained, pointing to a handwritten notation dated December 8th, the day Elaine died. Warfarin level, critically low patient claims, son manages medication. Attending dismissed as patient noncompliance. I disagree. Recommend investigation. The handwriting was steady, clinical, professional, not written weeks later with the benefit of hindsight. Written that day in real time by a nurse who saw something wrong and documented it even when her superior disagreed. This is contemporary evidence, Sherman said quietly. You wrote this the same day. I did, Priscilla confirmed. The attending physician told me I was overreacting, that elderly patients forget medication all the time, but something felt wrong, so I wrote it down, put it in my personal files. She looked at me directly. I should have pushed harder, she said. Should have demanded a full investigation, but I didn't have proof, just instinct, and instinct doesn't override a senior physician's judgment. You have it now, I said, thinking of the diary locked in my study. Sherman leaned forward. The question is, he said to Priscilla, are you willing to testify to this in court if it comes to that? To stand up in front of a judge and jury and say you suspected the son was harming his mother? Priscilla was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at me, at the grief I'd been carrying for 13 months, at the determination that had replaced it. I didn't push hard enough when it mattered, she said. I'll testify now. Someone needs to speak for her. Sherman made a note in his file. That's 3 major pieces of evidence, he said. The diary, the forged insurance signature, the medical records with a contemporary documentation of suspicious circumstances. We need a 4th. What 4th? I asked. Proof of where the money went, Sherman said. $750,000. We can show he collected it. We can show he forged signatures to get it. We can show suspicious medical circumstances. But to prove premeditation for financial gain, we need to show he spent it. Bank records, purchase records, evidence that he burned through his mother's life insurance on himself. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 witnesses to 1 truth: my son killed his mother. I'll get the bank records, I said. We left Sherman's office at noon. I drove home thinking about Priscilla's willingness to testify about contemporary documentation written the day Elaine died, about a nurse who'd known something was wrong and been dismissed. Wednesday afternoon, the 17. I came home to find Paloma waiting for me in the hallway. She had her phone in her hand. Her face was pale but determined. I need to talk to you, she said. I stopped, looked at her, saw something different in her expression, not the defensive daughter-in-law who'd laughed at my humiliation. Something harder, something that had been making decisions. I recovered deleted messages from Wilder's phone, she said, holding up her screen. From his cloud backup. These are from 8 months ago. She showed me the screenshot. A conversation between Wilder and an unknown number. Vague references. The woman and resolving the problem, and everything will be taken care of. Not explicit, not a confession, but suspicious. Especially to someone looking for reasons to be suspicious. Who is the woman he's talking about? Paloma asked. What problem did he resolve? I studied the screenshot, studied her face. Where did you get this? I asked. I've been looking, she said. Ever since you said the money would ruin my life. I've been going through his phone backups, his emails, anything I could access, looking for what you weren't telling me. She'd chosen to look. That meant she was already halfway to believing. These messages aren't, I said. They're not enough, not for what you're thinking. But there's something, she said. And combined with everything else, the way he talks about money, the way he treats you, the way he gets phone calls at 2 a.m. and goes pale, they're enough to make me ask. She took a breath. So I'm asking you directly now, she said. Do I need to know? I looked at this 29-year-old woman who'd married a murderer without knowing it, who'd spent his blood money on a wedding dress and a honeymoon, who was now standing in my hallway with deleted text messages asking for a truth that would destroy her life. Do you want to know the truth? I asked. Long pause. She looked at her phone, at the vague messages that had made her suspicious enough to search, brave enough to confront. Yes, she said finally. I need to know. We stood in that hallway, me holding the answer that would destroy her marriage, her holding the courage to ask for it anyway. 43 days left on the countdown. I had to decide how much truth one person could carry. I thought about Elaine's diary, about the insurance documents, about Priscilla's medical notes, about everything I'd learned in the past 3 weeks. Paloma had been lied to, used, made an accomplice without her knowledge, but she'd also chosen to search, chosen to ask, chosen truth over comfortable ignorance. That had to mean something. Come with me, I said. I led her to the study and unlocked the door. The study door swung open. I gestured for Paloma to wait, went to my desk, and retrieved Elaine's diary from the locked drawer. We didn't stay in the study. Too formal, too much like an interrogation. I led her to the kitchen instead. I placed my dead wife's diary on the kitchen table between us, and Paloma's hand trembled as she reached for it, not because she was afraid of what she'd find, but because some part of her already knew. Not all of it, I said, just these pages. I'd marked specific entries with paper clips, spring entries from over a year ago, before Elaine went to the hospital, before she died. Paloma opened the first marked page and began reading. Her voice was quiet at first. March 12th. Wilder asked me to sign new insurance papers today. He says we need more coverage. I don't understand why $200,000 isn't enough. He says it's for his future for grandchildren we might have. She turned the page. April 8th, the insurance company called. They approved the increase very quickly, only 3 days. I mentioned this to Wilder, and he seemed pleased. But the agent sounded surprised too. Said most applications take weeks. This felt too fast, too easy. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight. Somewhere in the house, pipes groaned as the heating cycled on. Normal sounds in an abnormal moment. Paloma looked up at me. The money came too fast. She read aloud from the next entry. Wilder asked me not to question it, but mothers always question. She set the diary down. "This is what paid for our wedding," she asked. I nodded. "The insurance payout came through last January," I said, 11 days after I buried her. "Your wedding was in March, 2 months later." She stood up abruptly, walked to the sink, gripped the counter edge. "I wore a dress bought with stolen money," she said. "I said vows in a venue paid for with fraud. What does that make me?" "Someone who didn't know," I said. She turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. "But I should have asked," she said. "Where does a man with no job suddenly get enough money for a $60,000 wedding?" I should have questioned it. I should have. "You trusted your husband," I said. "That's not a crime." She sat down heavily, the chair scraping against the floor. Pages of the diary scattered slightly from the movement. "I needed you to understand what kind of man you married," I said before I showed this to authorities. "Authorities," she repeated. "You're going to report him." "I already am," I said. She looked at me with something between gratitude and devastation. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not telling me everything at once." I nodded, gathered the diary pages, locked them back in my study. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when I returned. Thursday passed in silence. Paloma stayed in her room. I stayed in mine. The house felt like a shared grief we weren't ready to speak about yet. Friday morning, day 19, Sherman called. "The insurance company is ready to talk," he said. "Can you be at their regional office in an hour?" I could. The insurance company held the final piece I needed, but would they hand it over or bury it to protect themselves? Drop your theory in the comments about whether corporations ever choose justice over liability, or if they always protect their bottom line first. Just a heads up, this is fiction for storytelling purposes, not a documentary on insurance fraud. Sherman met me in the parking lot. We walked into a sterile corporate building, rode an elevator to the 3rd floor, and were led to a conference room where a man in a gray suit was waiting. Daniel Morrison looked like every corporate investigator I'd ever seen, gray suit, tired eyes, folder full of things he wished he could have acted on 18 months ago. "Mr. Stafford," he said, standing to shake my hand, "thank you for coming." Sherman sat beside me. Morrison spread files across the conference table. "We knew something was wrong when the approval came through that fast," Morrison said, opening the first folder. "Life insurance doesn't work at venture capital speed. A $750,000 policy processed in 72 hours that triggered every automatic flag we have." "You paid it anyway," Sherman said. "We paid because we had no choice," Morrison said. "Suspicion isn't evidence. The signatures looked legitimate. The medical examiner ruled natural causes. We had no external proof to deny the claim. So we paid." He pulled out another document. "But we've been waiting for evidence ever since," he continued. "Internal audit 6 months ago discovered something. One of our employees, Rachel Vasquez, received $15,000 in cash deposits, small increments over 3 weeks, right after approving your wife's policy increase." Morrison had a coffee stain on his folder, small, brown, shaped like California. The kind of detail you notice when someone's telling you they've been complicit in a cover-up for 18 months. "We terminated Vasquez," Morrison said, "but we couldn't pursue criminal charges without proof linking the payment to your son, until now." Sherman slid his compiled files across the table. FBI financial records showing Wilder's loan shark debts, medical documentation from Priscilla Lambert, the forged signature analysis. Morrison reviewed each page carefully. When he finished, he looked up at me. "Is that enough now?" I asked. Morrison closed the folder. "More than enough," he said. "We'll file a formal fraud report with law enforcement within 48 hours. Given the medical circumstances, they will likely escalate to homicide investigation." He paused. "You'll need to testify," he said, "to all of it, from the beginning." "I'll testify to everything Ghidorah said, from day one." We left the insurance office at noon, stood in the parking lot beside Sherman's car. "It's 41 days left," Sherman said, referencing the mortgage deadline. 41 days, I repeated. I walked out of that insurance office knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I'd committed to testify from day one, which meant admitting I'd suspected murder the moment I saw my wife's body and spent 60 days proving it. 41 days left on Wilder's countdown. But my own countdown had just started. My countdown started with a phone call Monday morning. Sherman's voice on the phone sounded like he'd aged a decade in the 48 hours since our insurance meeting. And when he told me what he'd found in the hospital records, I understood why. I went back through every page of Elaine's medical file, he said. The official records, the nursing logs, everything. Found something the hospital didn't flag. I was in my study, closed the door. What did you find? The nurse's office log shows 4 outgoing calls to your number, Sherman said. December 6th, 7th, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. I sat down slowly. I never received them, I said. Not one. I know, Sherman said, because your number was on the blocked list, hospital contact restrictions. Someone requested absolute rest for the patient, no incoming calls, no outgoing to family members. My hands tightened on the phone. Who requested it? I asked, though I already knew. Guess who signed the request form? Sherman said. I looked out the study window. Wilder was in the driveway washing his BMW, whistling. The same hands that held the sponge had signed a hospital form, blocking my wife's desperate attempts to reach me. She'd tried to call me 4 times. In her final days, knowing something was wrong, she'd tried to warn me, and our son had made sure I never heard the phone ring. I hung up and stood at the window, watching my son wash his car in the driveway, the same hands that signed a hospital form to silence a dying woman. He looked happy, relaxed, like a man washing his car on a Monday morning without a care in the world. 48 hours ago, I'd committed to testifying. Now I had proof he'd not only harmed his mother, but actively prevented her from calling for help. Sherman, I said, calling him back. When can we go to the FBI? This afternoon, he said. I already made the call. The FBI field office in Los Angeles was a fortress of beige concrete and tinted windows. Sherman and I sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor waiting. FBI agent James Cooper walked in at 2:30. He had the kind of face that revealed nothing. 30 years of interviewing liars had trained every muscle into professional neutrality. He shook our hands with the firm grip of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and sat down across from us. I understand you have information about Wilder Stafford, Cooper said, opening a folder. You know that name, I said. It wasn't a question. Cooper's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes confirmed it. Wilder Stafford is on our radar for loan shark involvement, he said. He's been cooperative with an ongoing investigation into organized lending operations in Orange County. Why are you here about him? The Wikes, that in the West Bikes stove. Sherman slid the compiled evidence across the table. Medical records, the diary, insurance documents, the blocked phone log. Cooper reviewed each page methodically. When he reached Priscilla Lambert's handwritten notation about low warfarin levels, he paused. This is from the hospital where his mother died, Cooper said. My wife, I said. Elaine Stafford. She died December 8th, 13 months ago. Heart failure due to blood clots. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes. Cooper kept reading, reached the page showing the blocked phone calls. She tried to call you, he said quietly. 4 times, I confirmed. I never received them. Wilder signed a hospital form blocking my number from reaching her room and blocking her from calling out to family. Cooper set down the papers, looked at me directly for the first time. You're saying your son prevented his dying mother from contacting you for help, he said. I'm saying he killed her, I said, and made sure she couldn't tell anyone before she died. Cooper was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out another file from his briefcase. Wilder Stafford came to us 3 months ago, Cooper said, claiming loan sharks were pressuring him into insurance fraud. He positioned himself as a victim, being coerced into forging signatures and staging false claims. He was setting up his defense, Sherman said. Yes, Cooper agreed. But this, he tapped the medical records. This is a completely different charge. This isn't financial fraud under duress. This is potential homicide for financial gain. She was dying and she tried to reach me, I said, 4 times, and he made sure I never knew. Cooper's office walls were covered with surveillance photos of men who thought they'd gotten away with it. Wilder would be joining them soon. What do you need from me? I asked. Testimony, Cooper said. All of it. The timeline, the insurance, increased the medical circumstances, your wife's suspicions documented in the diary. We'll need the original diary as evidence. The hospital will cooperate once we have a warrant. The insurance company's fraud report will support the financial motive. He closed the folder. 2 weeks, he said. We'll need 2 weeks to build the case, properly coordinate with the insurance fraud division, and get medical expert testimony. We'll have enough for an arrest warrant by mid-January. 2 weeks, I repeated. Is that acceptable? Cooper asked. I thought about Elaine trying to call me from a hospital bed. Thought about Wilder whistling while washing his car. Thought about the forged mortgage deadline still ticking down with 38 days remaining. It's acceptable, I said. We left the FBI building at 4 in the afternoon. The January sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Sherman and I got into his car. He didn't start the engine right away. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked. I looked at the FBI building behind us, thought about 4 unanswered phone calls from a hospital room, about a woman dying alone because someone decided she shouldn't speak. She called me 4 times, I said. I'm sure. Sherman drove me home in silence. I was sure. The FBI was sure. 2 weeks until the arrest. 2 days after I told the FBI, I was sure Wilder walked into the dining room and asked if I'd consider selling my dead wife's house so he could buy his own. Wednesday evening. I'd made a simple dinner, rice, vegetables, fish. Enough for 3, though Paloma had stayed upstairs. Wilder sat across from me at the table, where Elaine and I had shared thousands of meals. He'd been quieter than usual the past few days, watching me, like an animal that senses a trap but can't see the mechanism yet. I've been thinking, he said, pushing food around his plate. What if you sold this house? You don't need all this space. You could downsize, give me a share of the proceeds so Paloma and I could buy our own place. Start fresh. I set down my chopsticks. And this house isn't for sale, I said. But you're old, he said. What are you doing alone in this big house? It's too much for one person. You could get a condo, something manageable. We'd all be better off. I looked at my son across the table, saw him trying the same manipulation that had worked 1,000 times before, saw him calculating, adjusting, searching for the angle that would make me bend. I'm not old enough to forget you owe me rent next month, I said. His smile faltered for just a second. About that, he started. $2,800, I said. First of the month, per the agreement you signed. Across the table, my son smiled like he always had, like he'd already won, like he always would. We'll figure something out, he said. He had no idea the FBI was 12 days away from putting him in handcuffs. I finished my dinner in silence, washed my plate, went to my study and locked the door. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. I woke at 6:30, made tea, and sat in the kitchen waiting. At 7 o'clock exactly, I heard the cars pull into my driveway. 3 vehicles, 6 agents. I watched through the window as James Cooper stepped out of the first car wearing a dark suit and the same neutral expression he'd worn in his office. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock. Cooper stood on my porch with 2 other agents flanking him. Behind them, 3 more agents waited by the cars. Mr. Stafford, Cooper said. We have a warrant for Wilder Stafford's arrest. He's upstairs, I said. 2nd bedroom on the right. I stepped aside. Let them enter my house. Let them walk past me up the stairs. I heard Wilder's door open, heard Cooper's voice calm and professional. Wilder Stafford, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, forged signatures, and suspected homicide in the death of Elaine Stafford. You have the right to remain silent. I heard Paloma's gasp from somewhere upstairs, heard Wilder's voice sharp and confused. What this is, there's been a mistake. Footsteps on the stairs. Cooper descended first, then Wilder between 2 agents' hands cuffed behind his back. Paloma followed her hand over her mouth, still in her bathrobe. Wilder's eyes found mine as they led him past. He stopped. The agents let him. You did this, he said. I looked at my son. At his face, that was Elaine's face. At his eyes that had watched her die and felt nothing. At the man who'd killed his mother for money and then asked me to sell her house. I wanted to say something, wanted to explain, wanted to tell him I'd found the diary, the medical records, the blocked phone calls. Wanted to tell him his mother had tried to warn me, and he'd made sure I never heard. But I just stood there. Silence was the only honest answer I had. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound I'll hear for the rest of my life. Cooper nodded to his agents. They led Wilder toward the door. At the threshold, Wilder turned back one more time. Looked at me like he was searching for the father who'd carried him on his shoulders, who'd taught him to change oil, who'd believed every lie for 13 months. That father was gone. Had been gone since the moment I read Elaine's diary. I'm your son, Wilder said. I know, I said. That was all. They walked him out to the waiting car, put him in the back seat, drove away. Cooper stayed behind for a moment. We'll need your formal statement this afternoon, he said, and we'll need the original diary as evidence. I nodded. Thank you, Cooper said, for doing the right thing. He left. The door closed behind the FBI agents. Paloma stood frozen on the stairs, her hands still covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I stood frozen in the hallway, watching dust particles float in the morning light coming through the window. We'd gotten justice. The insurance fraud proven, the forged signatures exposed, the medical evidence compiled, the blocked phone calls documented. Everything I'd worked for these past weeks had led to this moment. But the house had never felt emptier. I'd lost my son twice. Once to greed when he'd chosen money over his mother's life. Once to handcuffs when I'd chosen justice over family loyalty. Both losses were permanent. I walked to the kitchen, made another cup of tea I didn't drink, looked out the window at the driveway where 3 FBI cars had been parked 5 minutes ago. Elaine's chessboard sat in the living room with her red rook still in position. Her toolbox sat on the shelf with the diary I'd have to surrender this afternoon. Her house, our house, stood around me like a monument to everything we'd built and everything our son had destroyed. And I'd never felt more like I'd lost everything that mattered. I stood in that empty hallway for a long time. Paloma had disappeared back upstairs. The house was silent except for the clock ticking in the living room. 3 hours after they took my son away in handcuffs, his wife walked down the stairs carrying 2 suitcases and her passport. She didn't see me at first. I was in the kitchen standing at the window staring at nothing. She set the suitcases down in the living room with a soft thud. I walked out to face her. I'm leaving, she said. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. She'd made a decision and was following through. You're not at fault in this, I said. I lived off that money, she said. I wore clothes bought with it. I ate food paid for with it. I said wedding vows in a church funded by insurance fraud, and her voice cracked. And whatever else he did. She didn't say murder, couldn't say it yet, but she knew. You didn't know, I said, and when you did know you chose to search for the truth. You showed me those text messages. You asked the hard questions. You told me you needed to know. She shook her head. And that doesn't change what I spent, she said, what I accepted without questioning. Do you have anywhere to go? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she finally said. I looked at this 29-year-old woman standing in my living room, with everything she owned packed into 2 suitcases. She'd married a murderer without knowing it. She'd been used as cover for his crimes. She'd spent money she thought was legitimate while he manipulated everyone around him. And now she was trying to punish herself for his sins. It'd stay here for 30 days, I said. Let things settle down, figure out what comes next. You're not at fault. You don't need to run. Her suitcases sat by the door like accusations, but I'd spent 60 days learning the difference between guilt and proximity. Why, she asked, why would you let me stay? I'm his wife. You're a victim, I said, just like Elaine was. She started crying again, not the quiet tears from earlier, deep shaking sobs that came from somewhere she'd been holding locked since the FBI walked through the door. I didn't try to comfort her, just let her cry, let her release whatever she needed to release. When she finally stopped, she wiped her face with her sleeve. The 30 days, she repeated. It's 30 days. I confirmed. No rent, no expectations. Just time to breathe and think. She picked up one suitcase, then the other, carried them back upstairs. I stood in the living room, listening to her footsteps above me, heard her door close, heard the sound of her unpacking, slowly, deliberately, putting her life back in drawers and closets for another month. Evening fell. The house grew dark. I didn't turn on many lights, just sat in the living room, where Elaine's chessboard still held her final move. Around 8, Paloma came back downstairs. She stood in the doorway uncertain. "Oh, why are you being kind to me?" she asked. I thought about that question. About kindness and justice and the difference between punishing the guilty and protecting the innocent. Because I don't punish someone who is only guilty of trusting the wrong people, I said. She walked into the room, sat in the chair across from me. You lost your wife and your son, she said, and I'm still here. You are, I agreed. Does that make you angry? I thought about it honestly. No, I said. You were deceived. That's not the same as being complicit. Outside January, rain started falling, the first real rain since Elaine died. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, not talking, just two people who had survived the same storm from different directions. What happens now? Paloma asked. Now the FBI builds their case, I said. Now the lawyers get involved. Now the legal system does what it's supposed to do. To him, she said. To him, I confirmed. And to you, there's still the forged mortgage to deal with, I said. 34 days left to prove he fraudulently used this house as collateral. But Sherman's handling that. I've done my part. She was quiet again. I should hate you, she said finally. You turned in my husband. You destroyed my marriage. You took away everything I thought my life was going to be. I know, I said. But I don't, she continued. I hate him for lying, for using me, for everything he did. But you just told the truth, and the truth was always there. I just couldn't see it until you made me look. I nodded. Thank you, she said. For the 30 days, for not blaming me, for treating me like a person instead of an accomplice. She went back upstairs shortly after. I sat alone in the dark living room, listening to the rain, thought about Wilder in a cell somewhere, thought about Elaine's diary now, in FBI evidence storage, thought about justice and mercy and the impossible choice between a son and the truth. I'd chosen truth, and it had cost me everything. But sitting there in the rain-sound darkness, I felt something I hadn't felt in 14 months. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just peace. That night I went to bed at my usual time. Lay down in the same bed I'd shared with Elaine for 30 years. Closed my eyes expecting the usual insomnia, the usual loop of questions and what-ifs. Instead, I slept. Slept without nightmares for the first time in 14 months. Not because my son was in a cell. Not because justice had been served. Not because I'd won some battle. But because I'd chosen mercy over judgment for someone who deserved it. Because I'd extended grace to Paloma when I could have extended blame. Because somewhere in the past 60 days of investigation and evidence and confrontation, I'd learned that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. And neither one brought peace. Only mercy did that. 34 days remained on Wilder's forged mortgage deadline, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since I'd buried my wife, I slept soundly. 9 days after I gave her 30, Paloma came downstairs with her suitcases repacked lighter this time, like she'd left part of her old life behind. I was at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the mortgage deadline calendar on the wall. 18 days left. The FBI had Wilder in custody, but his forged loan was still a ticking clock strapped to my house. You're leaving early, I said, not a question. Paloma set her bags by the door, just 2 this time, not the mountain of designer luggage she'd arrived with. I found a studio in Long Beach, month-to-month lease. I start at the hospital full-time on Monday. She pulled an envelope from her purse and set it on the table between us. Through the paper, I could see the outline of a check. $3,200, she said. 2 months rent like we agreed. You gave me 30 days. I'm leaving on day 9. It's only fair. I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. Keep it. Mr. Stafford. You need first month's rent for Long Beach. Security deposit. You're starting over. Keep it. Her hand trembled as she pushed the envelope closer. Please, I need to pay what I owe. I picked up the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the check. Her handwriting was surprisingly neat, the kind of penmanship they don't teach anymore. Pay to the order of Arthur Stafford. $3,200. I tore it in half, then tore it again, and again. You don't owe me rent, I said, dropping the pieces in the trash can beside the table. You owe yourself a different life than the one my son was selling you? Paloma's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Just nodded, picked up her bags, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob. That night at the restaurant when I first met him, he told me his mother had just died. He cried. I thought I was comforting someone who was grieving. Her voice cracked. I didn't know I was comforting her killer. I know, I said. Go build something real, Paloma. You're 29. You've got time. After she left, I looked down at the trash can. The torn check pieces in the trash looked like snow. I didn't leave the house for 2 days. Didn't answer the phone. Didn't open the mail. The mortgage deadline calendar stared at me from the wall. 16 days, 15 days, 14 days. Each one crossed off with a red marker that felt heavier every morning. On day 38, the doorbell rang. Thomas and Martha Evans stood on my porch with a casserole dish covered in foil, my next-door neighbors for 11 years, and I'd probably spoken to them a dozen times total. We heard about your son, Susan said quietly. We're so sorry, Arthur. I didn't know what to say to that. Sorry my son murdered his mother. Sorry he got caught. Richard held out the casserole. It's chicken pot pie. Susan makes it when Well, when words don't help. I took the dish because refusing felt cruel. Thank you. They didn't stay, didn't ask questions, just a nod and a hand on my shoulder from Richard, and they were gone. The pot pie sat in my fridge for 3 days before I heated a portion. It was good, better than anything I'd made myself in a month. I ate it standing at the counter crying for the first time since Wilder's arrest. Not for him. Not even for Elaine. Just crying because 2 people I barely knew had seen me drowning and thrown me a rope made of chicken and pastry crust. Ralph showed up on day 40. Let himself in through the back door like he'd done 1,000 times over 30 years of friendship. "You look like hell," he said, dropping into the chair across from me. "I feel worse." He studied me with those sharp eyes that had observed people's darkest and brightest days for 40 years. "Do you regret it? Turning him in?" I'd been asking myself that question for 9 days straight. Every morning I woke up. Every night I couldn't sleep. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it was necessary. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But turning him in, Number Elaine deserved justice more than Wilder deserved protection." Ralph nodded slowly. "Good. Because the Arthur I've known for 3 decades wouldn't have been able to live with himself if he'd chosen differently. I'm not sure I can live with this choice either." "Maybe not," Ralph said, "but at least you'll die honest." After he left, I sat at Elaine's old writing desk in the study, the one she'd used for thank you notes and Christmas cards and the occasional letter to her sister in Portland. I pulled out a sheet of her stationery, cream-colored, with her initials embossed at the top. My hand shook as I wrote his name on the envelope. Wilder. Not son, not dear Wilder, just his name like an accusation. I wrote for an hour, crossed out whole paragraphs, started over. The words came in fragments. "You killed the only person who loved you unconditionally. I don't know if you felt anything when you put that pillow over her face. She used to brag about you to her book club, even after you stopped calling. I should have seen it sooner. The financial requests, the visits that only came when you needed something." The letter grew to 3 pages before I finally wrote the only sentence that mattered. "I will never forgive you, but I will always be your father, and that is a prison sentence I'll serve until I die." I folded the pages, slid them into the envelope with his name on it, and reached for the desk drawer where Elaine kept her sealing wax. A vintage set I'd given her on our 20th anniversary burgundy wax she'd only used for special occasions. My hand hovered over the drawer pull. I couldn't open it. Couldn't seal the letter, couldn't make it final. I placed the unsealed envelope in the locked drawer, where I kept Elaine's jewelry and the deed to the house. Things that mattered, things I needed to protect. The letter sat in the locked drawer unsealed. Maybe someday I'd finish it, seal it, send it. Maybe someday Wilder would deserve to read it. But 18 days remained on his forged mortgage deadline, and I still had one more fight left. The physical reclamation of my house became a battle against stained walls and worn carpet, a slow process of erasing the evidence that my son had ever lived here. 3 days after locking his unsealed letter in my drawer, I stood in the upstairs bedroom where Wilder and Paloma had slept. The air was heavy with her perfume, and his cologne a chemical sweetness that made my stomach turn. I threw open both windows, letting the freezing February breeze strip the scent away. I began by repairing the electrical outlets Wilder had violently yanked from the drywall. After cutting the power, I pulled the damaged boxes and wired new ones. My back protested, but my hands remembered the labor. At 60, I was still doing my own electrical work. Next came the carpet, which I tore up in long, heavy strips. Beneath it lay the original hardwood Elaine and I had installed back in 1998. The gray fibers were ruined with deep stains, residue from a relationship entirely built on greed and betrayal. I rented a heavy floor sander and spent 2 days on my knees stripping the wood down to bare grain. Dust filled my hair and settled deep into the creases of my palms, but I welcomed the exhaustion. Every stroke of the sander felt like physically scrubbing my son out of the house. On day 48, Ralph found me standing on a ladder, rolling fresh white primer over walls that had been beige for 15 years. He watched from the doorway before asking, "You're doing all this yourself?" Without looking down, I kept the roller moving in steady vertical lines. "I've done it all myself for 60 years, I replied quietly. The familiar words hung between us. It was the exact phrase I had thrown at Wilder months ago, when I was blind and angry, but now it was just a quiet statement of fact. A man who could rewire his own home and restore his own floors didn't need blood money. When Ralph offered to help, I thanked him, but declined. I needed to finish this alone. While moving the old dresser on day 51, I discovered a faded photograph wedged against the baseboard. It was a picture of Wilder at 8 years old, grinning as he sat balanced on my shoulders at the Long Beach pier, while Elaine held the camera. I stared at his small hands holding my head completely frozen for 20 minutes. I searched that young boy's face, desperately trying to find the exact moment the crack formed the choice that turned a laughing child into a man capable of ending his mother's life for an insurance payout. I couldn't find it. I could only remember the weight of him on my shoulders and his absolute confidence that I would never let him fall. I placed the photograph in the locked drawer, with the letter unsure if I would ever understand it. By day 55, the upstairs renovation was complete. The spaces were empty clean and painted fresh. The upcoming mortgage deadline felt like a physical weight on my chest each morning, but the house was finally silent. On day 58, Ralph walked in carrying a Chinese chess set. "You've been working for 2 weeks," he said, setting the board on the coffee table. "Sit down." I lowered myself into my usual chair, looking at the pieces. Ralph had arranged the starting positions, but he carefully worked around the center of the board. Elaine's red rook remained exactly 3 spaces forward and 2 spaces right, the last move she had made the morning before she died. Ralph left that specific square occupied by a ghost. We played until noon in total silence, the quiet click of wooden pieces echoing in the room, while winter sunlight cut through the window. "What will you do now?" Ralph asked, advancing his chariot. I shifted my elephant. "Live." He paused. "Just that." I looked at the board. "That's enough." The game eventually drifted into a natural stalemate. Ralph packed his pieces at sunset, leaving the red rook untouched. After he left, I sat alone in the dark room, staring at the permanent piece and the empty chair across from me. 2 days remained until the bank's deadline. Tomorrow, I would face the lawyers. Tonight, I just sat with the quiet. 4 months after they took my son away, I woke up in a house that finally felt like mine again. The forged mortgage had collapsed under its own fraudulent weight after Sherman's lawyer presented the bank with irrefutable evidence of the forgery, forcing them to drop the foreclosure claim entirely. The deed was mine, clear and uncontested. May sunlight filled the kitchen as I brewed loose-leaf tea exactly 3 minutes the way Elaine used to. Looking out at the quiet Westminster yard, the space felt clean. The garage door was shut, housing my pristine F-15. Oh, where Wilder's dripping BMW used to sit. In the living room, Elaine's red rook remained in its permanent position on the chessboard. My phone buzzed on the counter. Sherman's text read, "Wilder's trial 18 months from now. Do you want to be a witness?" I stared at the screen. Elaine had been gone that long already. I hit reply and typed one word, "Yes." I walked into the study to retrieve Elaine's mechanical toolbox, returned by Agent Cooper after the investigation. Opening the heavy brass latches, I looked past her clock repair tools to the very bottom. There lay the single folded page I had torn out months ago, the one that read, "If something happens to me, give this to Arthur." I unfolded it, reading her neat teacher's script. She had written a message of absolute grace telling me she never blamed me for the emotional distance that she understood, and that she loved me unconditionally. She had written words of profound comfort for a husband she trusted entirely, unaware that it was our own son who would end her life weeks later. "I kept it safe," I whispered to the empty room. "Just for you." I refolded the paper along its original creases and placed it back at the bottom of the foam lining. This wasn't about closure. It was about keeping a promise to the only woman I ever loved. I fastened the latches and returned the heavy toolbox to its shelf. Standing in the doorway, I looked out at the ordinary morning. I was a 60-year-old man living alone, but the air was clear. The house was quiet. The truth was out. And I had finally found my peace. And to you listening to my story, remember this blood doesn't give anyone the right to betray you, and choosing truth over family loyalty isn't cruelty. It's courage. I spent years ignoring the signs because I didn't want to see what my son had become. I told myself every missed call, every financial request, every lie was just a phase. Don't make my mistake. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time, even if it's your own child. That's the hardest lesson any family story can teach. This family betrayal taught me that justice and mercy aren't opposites, they're partners. I turned my son over to the FBI, but I also gave my daughter-in-law a second chance because every family story deserves nuance, not just anger. Some people deserve consequences. Others deserve grace. I believe God gave me the strength to do what was right, even when it broke my heart. Family betrayal tests your character, but choosing truth over comfort is what defines you. If this family story moved you, please leave a comment and tell me, would you have done what I did? Could you turn in your own child? Share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing truth isn't betrayal. And if you're new to family betrayal, please subscribe. There are more stories here that might help you make sense of your own. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time and attention mean more than you know. A final note. Some details in this family betrayal have been adjusted for storytelling, but the heart of the lesson remains true. May you find the courage to choose what's right even when it costs you everything.